A fifth way of explaining the state is what we could call theoretico-logical. Just imagine the world without the state. Especially in economics, it is not unusual to assume, in models, the free exchange of goods and services. Actually, economics, strictly speaking, means an environment where goods and services can be exchanged freely, without forced intervention by an external entity. But in a world without the state, wouldn't the state itself be an externality? Don't we refer, expressis verbis or not, to an entity that benefits us all? For simplicity, we may call that entity the state. In other words, the state is an assumption. The state is the common ground on which transactions, economic or social transactions, become possible without an obligation for people engaged in interactions to constantly redefine the situations within which they act. The classical example of the theoretical-logical paradigm is the state of nature concept of the Enlightenment era, according to which the strongest argument for the state is the counterfactual assumption of anarchy. Its starting point is an if. If we lived in a state of nature, wouldn't life be, as Hobbes wrote in his Leviathan, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short? Wouldn't we lose our happiness, freedom, human civilization? Before we brush off this idea as far-fetched, we should remind ourselves that Hobbes and his contemporaries were rather realists than visionaries. Inspired by the new physics that later should be called Newtonian, they identified power as a force in the social world, like Galileo identified gravity as a force in the physical world. To imagine a physical world in which there is no energy would be an absurd idea. And equally absurd, entirely utopian, would it be to assume human interaction free from power. If we broadly define power with Max Weber as the probability that one actor in a social relationship will be in a position to carry out his will despite resistance, regardless of the basis on which this probability rests. Politics figures as only one specific subgroup of social relationships. If power is omnipresent, what makes political power so special? First, it is archaic. It can be traced back in history to a distant past. Despite a changing technology, its mechanism has remained remarkably stable. Charisma, leadership, authority, persuasion, force are some of its manifestations in history. Second, it is universal. It is found in all cultures, at all times, even if it does not always lead to state building. You may not spot rulers and ruled, but leaders and their followers, so that we can speak, at least of government, where we refrain from using the word state. Third, it is associative. It always amalgamates with other forms of power so that it can be separated from them only analytically. In reality, We are always dealing with admixtures and compounds. Fourth, it is possessive. It has the tendency to subordinate, suppress, or even eradicate all non-political forms of power. It has been noted that political power grows at the expense of social power. And it has been emphasized by the Austrian School of Economics that economic power, productivity, and wealth diminishes with the rise of the total state, to borrow von Hindenburg's adjective with which he described modern warfare. Fifth, it is destructive. The 20th century gave ample testimony to the destructiveness of political power. Once all checks removed, political power went berserk, leaving millions behind dead in the battlefields and in the cities turned mass necropolae, destituting and impoverishing millions who miraculously managed to survive. Surprisingly, political power always came back after a short respite during which other forms of power had naturally resurfaced. Let us now summarize our discussion. These 5 explanations of the nature of the state suggest that the state itself is to a higher or lesser degree a natural entity. I was speaking of the longevity of the state, which lies in the term itself. Doesn't longevity suggest that alternatives to the state are difficult to imagine and even more difficult to realize in practice? There have been suggestions to distinguish between state and government. Distinctions according to which government comes into existence as a quasi-externality and the state as an artificial product that developed in more recent times out of personal structure into impersonal structures. The dividing line between personal and impersonal certainly is the French Revolution. Paraphrasing Nozick, we may ask, how much room does the state leave for individual rights? Or quoting Nozick, how much room do individual rights leave for the state? It does not need much imagination to see that these two questions lead to contrary ideas of the state. If we assume the priority of the state, we have no choice but to link human existence to the state. If we do have unalienable rights, qua human existence, we must construct the state. Having completed the first task, we now can turn to the second.